An unfinished journey. That describes the role of the federal courts in the civil rights movement for people with developmental disabilities. It's a movement that mirrors the broader fight for civil rights in America, but with a history and path of its own. This production is based on an exhibit produced by the U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota and their Public Outreach Committee. As we reflect, one thing is clear. People with developmental disabilities have been waiting for their rights since Minnesota became a state in 1858. They've waited for over 100 years for the right to treatment, education, to live in a neighborhood, basic civil rights, the most integrated setting, freedom from restraint and seclusion, and to vote. And are still waiting to be treated as equal citizens in life and work. How did people with developmental disabilities come to live in institutions? In 19th century America, conditions for people with disabilities were harsh, and many families lacked the resources to provide care for their loved ones. People with disabilities, along with others living in poverty, were sometimes placed in poorhouses. Minnesota established the Hospital for the Insane in St. Peter in 1866. Additional state institutions were built over the next 90 years. The state took custody of people with developmental disabilities and placed them in these newly formed institutions, away from their families and local communities. The institutions started as training schools, but as populations increased, the commitment to education and training was lost, and institutions became custodial. People were treated like prison inmates, or worse. Residents were forced to work for free to support the institutions. Some residents worked as unpaid laborers to care for others. Others performed hard physical labor on farm colonies to sustain the large institutional population. Misinformation and mistreatment. By the early 1900s, people with disabilities became scapegoats for society's ills. A misinformation movement promoted the menace of feeble-mindedness, a belief that people with disabilities were dangerous, immoral, and capable of ruining the gene pool. As late as 1920, the U.S. Public Health Service combined criminals, defectives, and delinquents into a single category. The institutions had insufficient staff. People were often locked in rooms or housed in dormitories, sometimes restrained in a chair or bed, all day. Minneapolis Tribune reporter Jerry Joseph described the horrific conditions she saw in 1948. There were just an incredible number of people who were literally tied up. They'd have leather cuffs, or some of them would be spread eagle, tied to beds. Pigs were treated better than people. In 1949, Governor Luther Youngdahl took a stance against restraints by burning the restraint equipment in a bonfire outside Anoka State Hospital. By 1961, more than 6,000 people with developmental disabilities lived in Minnesota's state institutions. Eugenics and dehumanization. The early 1900s saw the rise of the eugenics movement. The National Institutes of Health describes eugenics as the scientifically erroneous and immoral theory of racial improvement and planned breeding. Eugenicists believed that involuntary sterilization and segregation in institutions would eliminate those deemed unfit. Charles F. Dite, a doctor in Minneapolis, founded the Minnesota Eugenics Society in 1923. He helped shape Minnesota's law authorizing the sterilization of people with disabilities. This law led to the involuntary sterilization of over 2,000 Minnesotans between 1925 and 1945, 77% of whom were women. Parents start fighting for rights. In September 1950, 90 parents from 15 states came together in Minneapolis to participate in the first National Parent Association Conference. Reporter Jerry Joseph called them parents with a purpose. They had no money and no formal organization. They were strangers with only one goal: to help their loved ones. Governor Youngdahl wholeheartedly supported their aspirations and delivered a speech about rights at the conference. This effort led to what is now called the ARC, which is the largest national grassroots advocacy organization working for and with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Parents and parent associations often served as plaintiffs in early federal lawsuits about the right to treatment and the right to education. Parents and families continue to work on public policy issues at state and federal levels. Self-advocacy. Self-advocacy began in the United States in 1974. Today, there are hundreds of self-advocacy groups around the country. Minnesota created the Self-Advocates Minnesota SAM network in 2007 with the support of Advocating Change Together, ACT, a grassroots disability rights organization. More than 50 self-advocacy groups around Minnesota are now connected and working together. Welsch versus Likins. In 1972, Richard Welsch, on behalf of his daughter Patricia and involuntarily committed residents of Minnesota's institutions, filed a lawsuit in federal court alleging that conditions violated their constitutional rights. Attorneys from the Legal Aid Society of Minneapolis represented the residents. The 12-day trial in 1973 exposed the lack of adequate staff, excessive use of medication and restraint, and a deplorable living environment. Judge Earl R. Larson issued an opinion in 1974, finding that anyone committed to an institution must receive minimally adequate treatment. Judge Larson wrote, "Everyone, no matter the degree or severity of disability, is capable of growth and development if given adequate and suitable treatment." His ruling guided the service system for the next several years, resulting in improved institutional conditions and expanded community options. Another trial in 1980 led to a settlement agreement covering a total of 8 institutions. The case was ultimately dismissed in 1989 after Judge David S. Doty approved the final Welsh settlement agreement. The closure of state institutions. The reforms initiated by Judge Larson's decisions demonstrated that alternatives to institutions were economically and morally preferable. In 1988, Governor Rudy Perpich proposed that all people with developmental disabilities be served in the community and that state institutions be phased out by 1999. The last resident of Minnesota's state institutions left the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center in 2000. Key federal laws. Minnesota's laws and institutional reforms often preceded federal action. Between 1973 and 1990, Congress enacted 3 important federal laws protecting the civil rights of people with disabilities: Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. Passing these laws was just the beginning of the fight to secure rights. In 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court interpreted the ADA to require states to provide people with disabilities the right to live in the most integrated setting. Obstacles to community integration. As institutions began to close, Minnesota saw dramatic expansion of community options for people with developmental disabilities. People with developmental disabilities face an ongoing struggle because of irrational prejudice and fear of change. Like other minority groups, people with disabilities had to fight for the right to live in a neighborhood of their choosing. In Two Harbors, Minnesota, in 1980, neighbors tried to stop a group home from opening by claiming they were not family, as required by zoning laws. The Minnesota Supreme Court disagreed and said they functioned as a family. The Jensen lawsuit and settlement. In 2008, the Minnesota Office of Ombudsman for Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities issued a report about a residential program called the Minnesota Extended Treatment Options, or MITO. The report found that residents were routinely restrained face down and placed in metal handcuffs and leg hobbles, even when the residents did not show aggressive behavior. James and Lori Jensen, along with the families of 3 other residents, filed a class action lawsuit in 2009 in the U.S. District Court, District of Minnesota. They alleged that the use of mechanical restraints and seclusion violated the residents' rights. Before trial, the parties agreed to settle the case. In December 2011, U.S. District Court Judge Donovan W. Frank approved the Jensen settlement agreement, which covered more than 300 residents. The agreement prohibited the use of mechanical, manual, prone, and chemical restraints, seclusion, and other painful techniques. As part of the Jensen settlement agreement, the state also agreed to develop and implement an Olmstead Plan. 12 years after the Olmstead decision, Minnesota still had not adopted its own plan. After rejecting several versions, Judge Frank approved the plan in September 2015, 4 years after the Jensen settlement agreement. Minnesota now has a plan for ensuring that individuals with disabilities can live, learn, work, and enjoy life in the most integrated setting. On October 24, 2020, the court's jurisdiction over the case and plan ended, but the work and implementation of the Olmstead Plan continues. Voting rights. The 15th and 19th Amendments to the Constitution prohibit a state from denying a U.S. citizen the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude or sex, but not disability. The right to vote generally is recognized as a liberty interest protected under the 14th Amendment. A state can only take that right away if it does not violate the due process or equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. Many states have provisions that deny the right to vote to people with mental incapacities. Under Minnesota's Constitution, people under guardianship and people who are insane or not mentally competent are not allowed to vote. However, Minnesota's laws on voting and guardianship provide that people under guardianship retain the right to vote unless that vote is specifically revoked in the guardianship proceeding or the person is judged legally incompetent. In 2013, the Eighth Circuit Court affirmed a 2012 decision by Judge Frank, holding that Minnesota's constitutional prohibition against voting based on guardianship status applies only when there has been a specific judicial finding of incapacity to vote. Beyond group homes. Group homes were, and still are, a vast improvement over the large institutions of the past, but for some, group homes became another form of segregation. In 2016, plaintiffs living in group homes in Minnesota filed the Murphy v. Harpstead lawsuit in federal court, claiming that the state's placement policies over-relied on group homes. In 2019, Judge Frank ruled that the state's policy violated the Constitution. The parties agreed to a settlement in 2022, requiring the state to take concrete steps to improve access and opportunities to people who wanted to move out of a group home. Judge Frank's 2023 order approving the Murphy Settlement Agreement ended with these words: "People with disabilities confront stigma and discrimination on a regular basis. It is a shameful part of our country's past and present. While many issues remain that are separate from this litigation, the court is hopeful that this agreement will create positive change. Ultimately, we will all be judged by how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society." A continuing movement. The disability rights movement has never stood still. In Minnesota, full inclusion remains a work in progress. While large institutions have closed, the challenge now is to ensure true informed choice, self-direction, and opportunity. The Olmstead decision opened the door for people with disabilities and their families to demand a full range of inclusive community services. For many Minnesotans with disabilities, especially those under guardianship or living in segregated settings, full inclusion is still something to fight for. Federal courts continue to play a role in shaping what those rights look like in practice, and each case, like Murphy v. Harpstead, asks the same fundamental question: are we offering real choice? The history you've heard is not distant. It lives in our laws, our neighborhoods, and our expectations for tomorrow.